Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. This week we turn to the United Arab Emirates, and we're very fortunate to have Dr Frauke Heard-Bey talking to us today. Frauke is both a long-standing member of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs and a long-term resident of the UAE, having first gone to Abu Dhabi in 1967, several years before the new state was created. Frauke studied history and political science in Heidelberg and received her PhD from the Freie Universität of West Berlin in 1967, when she followed her husband David to Abu Dhabi, collecting archival material about the Gulf from foreign sources such as the India Office Library in London, the State Archives of Portugal, Holland, Germany, France, and several other countries, was her sphere of work for 39 years. Along the way, she found time to publish numerous books and articles. Her most recent, published in 2016, is Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates and the Gulf, 50 Years of Transformation. And that transformation and the continuity is the core of her talk to us today. My own acquaintance with the UAE, though frequent, is utterly superficial. Working for several years on Afghanistan, Iraq, and Sudan made Dubai a staging post for me, at times on an almost monthly basis for much of a decade. But I rarely got beyond the airport or the Meridian Hotel. So I'm pleased that moderating questions today we have Robin Lamb, someone who really does know the region, a trustee of the RSAA and a former British ambassador to Bahrain. Robin spent almost the whole of his diplomatic career engaged with the Middle East, and in addition to his time in Bahrain, he was Consul General in Basra and had postings in Cairo, Jeddah, Khartoum, Kuwait, Riyadh, and Tripoli. He is currently Director General of the Libya British Business Council, a position he has held since 2009. And now, let me hand over to our speaker, Dr. Frauke Heard-Bey. Frauke.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this very nice introduction. The subject of my talk is the United Arab Emirates, in particular, the aspect of it being a federation, because it is the only federation that has survived, and it will actually be 50 years. It will have survived in 2020 and 21. My presentation is divided into three parts. First, I would say what was there before the Federation of the UAE. Then, how did the Federation fare in the first decades? And then, of course, what are the characteristics of the UAE now? My first slide shows how the Gulf was presented over many centuries, and that is, it was a homogeneous cultural world with no state borders, and it was easy for people from particularly those who lived in the ports of this of the Gulf to transit from one port to the other, and so it was a scene of age-old communication among the riparian communities, Persian and Arab. And it was traders, sailors, craftsmen, entire families could move around. On the Arab side of the shore, the society was tribally defined. It's a society that had, the tribes had over centuries migrated from the center of the Arabian Peninsula towards this coast, and where they now lived in the hinterland and on the coast. And these tribes, they recognized amongst them usually the leadership of one particular family, of the sheikhs. And often these families were the recognized leaders over many generations, the same families. Who became the ruler then? Who became the leader in a family? That was contested within the family. So there was no automatic descent. Many of these sheikhs were trying to get other tribes to be part of their bigger tribes, and so eventually there formed also some larger confederations, particularly the Confederation of the Baniyas, which was many tribes that had voluntarily acknowledged the leadership of a particular tribe within the Baniyas confederation, and also the Kawasim, which were a leading family that had its headquarters in the past, in the 18th century, on the Iranian shore near Linga, and later transferred its main power point to the coast of Ras Al Khaimah and beyond. In the late 18th century, these Kawasim, they had the strongest claim to the monopoly over the maritime carrying trade that was so strong within the Gulf and even into the Indian Ocean. This trade and this whole movement on in the waters of the Gulf was clashed with the British Indian Company, that itself, as a maritime organization, it claimed the use of the Gulf waters for trade and passage as she needed and pleased, and that quite often clashed with the, particularly with the Kawasim tribes. There were many issues between these two, and one of the issues was that the East India Company was seen as supporting the enemies of the Kawasim. That was at the time the Omanis from Kuwait, from Muscat and elsewhere. And the clashes became at times very stressful and difficult for the East India Company, that wanted to maintain safe passage up the Gulf to Basra and for overland connection to Britain. In the late 18th century, these clashes were from time to time confronted by the East India Company's navy, and a final push was then made in the winter of 1819-1820, and the final battle happened outside Ras Al Khaimah, in that area, and the Kawasim and their tribal folk were all beaten and into submission. And the offshore, or the end of all this, was that the East India Company offered or dictated a general treaty between the East India Company and the sheikhs of that coast, which were in the end not only Kawasim. The General Treaty of Peace, which was signed by 11 sheikhs, including also the Sheikh of Bahrain, and others along the coast, all of whom had come to Ras Al Khaimah to sign in January 1820. This treaty, here we see on the Arabic version of this preliminary treaty of January 1820, there was a certain controversy within the authorities in Bombay on how to formulate the text. Some wanted straightforward punishment, but others realized that it would make more sense to prepare the ground for offering friendship and cooperation. So in the end, this treaty did offer friendship and did offer a possibility for these two seafaring, or all these seafarers in the Gulf to come to a peaceful coexistence. And the treaty had the desired effect for the company. It certainly more or less sorted out the problem, and it was not a bad deal for the Arab side either, because towards the end of the 18th century, the pearling industry, or pearling, had become a very important means of income for all the communities living around the Gulf, but particularly for the Arab side of the Gulf, because the pearling beds are closer to the Arab shore. These fleets that always went, the pearling boats always went in groups and fleets from the particular ports, and tended to fight each other's problems out during the pearling season in the summer. And this disrupted this very important industry. Now, with this Treaty of Peace, it also put paid for having for not being allowed for the individual rulers to fight each other, or their people to fight each other. So a general treaty really helped to secure peace on the high seas during particularly the summer pearling season. This treaty was then periodically renewed with subsequent treaties. Eventually there was a treaty in perpetuity, and it certainly, by then, the tribes had realized that it did suit them particularly well, and it provided the means to enforce the peace on the high seas. And the peace was policed by the East India Company, which mostly really stayed over the horizon. They had no permanent fleet and no permanent patrolling. When there were disturbances, they came along and tried to sort it out. The pearling industry really did boom, partly because the market in India developed enormously profitably, and throughout the end of the 19th century until, as we all know, the pearling industry collapsed in the 1920s and 30s because of the invention of cultured pearls in Japan, and also because of the world financial crisis. There is the next slide is really shows that the things have moved on as far as the British were concerned. First of all, the East India Company was in 1858 It was made to cease to exist with an act of Parliament, and its dominion was taken over by the British government. And from then on, there's a British Indian government and no longer the East India Company. And by the end of the by the latter decades of the 19th century, the British government had other concerns with the Gulf. And the particular concern was that the threat of European powers possibly wanting to muscle in. In the first place, it was, of course, the French. Napoleon had even tried to make friendship with the Omanis and Muscat, and all this was threatening. And so the British government was very concerned about French, Russian, German influence in the Gulf, and feared the establishment of coaling stations by these nations, or consular arrangements, or that they tried to have monopolies on trade, or introduce shipping lines, which indeed they did, but they had to be tolerated. But the British Indian government was even more concerned with all these threats and developments than even London. And so the British Indian government was tried to monitor this as closely as possible. And the text that we see here on this slide is almost identical. Or the text, we don't see the text, but we see what it was meant to bring about, and that was that the rulers were obliged to, they signed on the dotted line and were obliged to not cede or sell any territory to any foreign nation except the British. And such agreements were almost identical agreements were signed by the ruler of Kuwait at the time, as the Sultan of Oman, and by several Southeast Arabian rulers and even headmen of the Northwest frontier. And one can read these agreements, and they're almost identical. This slide shows a photograph of the visit of Lord Curzon in the Gulf. He did a round of the entire all the ports, and the rulers of the various Emirates were bidden to come on board, and in this case, where all the Trucial rulers were bidden together, and Lord Curzon's ship, the Argonaut, was on the high seas outside Sharjah. This tour happened in 1903, and Lord Curzon reminded the sheikhs that Britain is their protector, and also that Britain had sacrificed a lot for bringing about this peace on the high seas. Lord Curzon's visit did not only impress the rulers, but it also, of course, had the effect that those rulers who were bidden to attend this great event became even more, their stature became even more important among all the other rulers, particularly those in the hinterland. The next relationship, or closer relationship, between the British and the Trucial states really came about when the representatives of one particular oil company, that is the Iraq Petroleum Company, at that stage called Petroleum Development Trucial Coast, sent representatives to try and, first of all, obtain agreements that just allowed the company to send people around the country, particularly geologists, and then, as a result of that, possibly to negotiate for concessions. But it was important at this stage that that these rulers did not only claim the territorial limitations of their rule, but which were really defined by the tribal limitations, as the rulers, as the tribes acknowledged the overlordship of particular ruler. But it was essential that these spheres of influence had to be consolidated by legally defined and agreed borders. Here we see the example of one of the first of such agreements, of such legal agreements, as far as the Gulf was concerned, and that was the agreement between the Saudi king at the time, Abdulaziz, and the British representatives of the Mandate to stop incursions of Saudi tribes into the Iraqi area of the mandated area, and that kind of agreements should have been possible as far as the Trucial states were concerned. The political status of the people with whom the oil company then got into contact needs to be looked at a bit more closely. In particular, that there was a growing difference now between those rulers on the coast and the rulers in the hinterland, who centuries before had been on an equal footing and and were in tribal relationship and tribal conflict. But the rulers on the coast, by dint of having relationship with the British, but of course also because of the pearling boom, had accumulated so much more power as compared to the sheikhs in the hinterland, who lost out and eventually had to really pay allegiance to one or the other of the Trucial rulers. Also, in these coastal settlements, in consequence of the pearling industry, these settlements had acquired a class of important merchants who also influenced politics in the 30s, and the sheikhs, the rulers, had to listen to their views, which at times seemed to be influenced also by developments in the rest of the world of wanting to make the communities where they lived more like the rest of the world. But in the 1930s, 1960s, then these tribal powers, the distribution of tribal powers decreased in importance, because by the 1960s, the economic differences due to some rulers having oil concessions and the prospect of the wealth which was expected in Abu Dhabi suddenly meant that there were the haves and the not haves, as opposed to the powers that had many tribes people and the others that didn't have so many. So that shifted throughout the 1930s. The next slide here shows the outcome of these negotiations, and it was in fact that between 1937 and 1939, 5 Trucial rulers agreed on concession agreements, proper concession agreements, with the Petroleum Development Trucial Coast. The last one to sign on the dotted line was Sheikh Shahboud of Abu Dhabi, and he signed, we see this agreement here, was signed in 1939 for 79 years. It was signed on behalf of PDTC by Brigadier Stephen Longrig. But this concession agreement and all the others were not possible to activate because, as in 1939, the World War broke out, and it was not possible to act on these concessions because there were not the men, not the steel, and not the money. So these concession agreements were dormant. However, the oil company did continue to pay the agreed amount for holding the concession. So the rulers did have some income. In the case of Abu Dhabi, the Sheikh Shahboud used some of that income from the concessions actually to build a fort, to really expand his fort and put some sort of like a palace around the old fort, which was of course not medieval but looked like a medieval fort. The oil companies started to act on the concession in 1949 slowly, and it took until 1960 that it was announced that oil was found in commercial quantities in Abu Dhabi, first offshore and then onshore, and the first oil exports began in 1962. One has to say that the oil company PDTC very soon after cancelled the agreements with any of the other Trucial states, and only Abu Dhabi remained as their concession. And in 19 1966, the oil company was asked by Sheikh Shahbood to rename its company to Abu Dhabi Petroleum Company and actually move the offices and the families that were by then working for them, offices into Abu Dhabi town. So in 1962, oil was exported from Abu Dhabi. Something else that changed on the entire coast, one has to say, but first of all for Abu Dhabi, was the change of leadership in Abu Dhabi in August 1966. Sheikh Shahbood, the ruler of Abu Dhabi for 38 years, this came to an end when his younger brother, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, was replacing him. He was really put into the position by the family with some logistic help from the British government, which also was certainly supporting this move with some of the diplomats, because Sheikh Shahbood had by then been considered as not being willing to push forward the practical development to the degree that people were expecting it. Sheikh Zayed himself had been a very effective representative for his brothers, a completely loyal representative in the very important eastern region of Abu Dhabi, and throughout the problem of the Bahrain issue in 1955. Sheikh Zayed demonstrated the capability and ability to take on the rulership. And he was immediately greeted with enthusiasm by the population of Abu Dhabi. And he soon made an impact on the rest of the Trucial coast. Here on this photo is just one which shows how the rulers on the Trucial coast, they continued to get together, but they continued to have their age-old tribal competition, but also friendships, and the rulers had selective contact with each other, and they often came together in informal consultation, and cooperation, like at weddings, camel races, and condolences. And of course, some rulers visited each other more than others. Also, some were related by marriage. And on this case here, we see Sheikh Zayed with the venerable old ruler of Ajman, Sheikh Rashid, in an informal meeting at a camel race. But the informal meetings were also considered by the British authorities as needing some amelioration, and altogether it was decided and considered that the British government should look towards the Trucial states with some idea of helping the states to move into at least the 20th century. And some of this help was to consolidate the common ground for practical cooperation between these 7 Trucial states, practical and routine. And but what was even more important, and the first thing that was instituted, was a security arrangement for the very unsecure hinterland. We have to remember that these geologists from the oil company needed to, when they went out for their surveys, they were very often in very insecure situations. And so the Trucial Oman Scouts were founded in 1951, officered by some British officers and otherwise some Iranian, Jordanian, and other, and eventually, obviously, also local men. The Trucial States Development Council was founded in 1952, and that was obviously a way of providing a meeting place for formal and periodic meetings between all the rulers. These meetings of the Trucial States Council always took place in Dubai, and they were presided over by the British political agent. But from 1965 onwards, the presidency then rotated among the 7 rulers. Alongside the council also was founded the Trucial States Development Fund, which was some money in first instance from the British government in 1954. But later on, some money also came from Kuwait and Bahrain. But in the later years of the Trucial States Development Fund, money was mostly provided by Abu Dhabi, even under Sheikh Shahboud. And then eventually Sheikh Zayed decided that all the money needed by this fund was going to come from Abu Dhabi. And that was in the later 1960s. The development fund helped to coordinate and instruct also people about better agricultural methods, and some roads where improvement to tracks were made. And of course, the health side of things was looked at. In 1951, the Maktoum Hospital in Dubai was built. It was the first hospital on the coast. Certainly, there was a mission hospital, but that's another matter. The Maktoum Hospital Committee was something also where all the rulers got together. They were members of the committee, and again, a chance for all of them to get together and discuss the various allocations also of the money of the fund and the running of the hospital and so on. So there was a means of laying a foundation really for these Trucial rulers to routinely work together. But one important thing was still missing, and that is to know really whose authority was where and how on the sort of in the territorial limitations of the ruler's power. And there, that was a very important contribution by the British government, that they obliged a British diplomat, Julian Walker, to go around and establish, by talking to all the rulers and all the people on the coast, where these borders lay. And you see on the next slide the extent of this of the map that came about. And that map is really, Julian Walker's map is still the map basically that has been upheld and with very few exceptions honored by all the Trucial rulers and later on by the members of the UAE. We see on this map also, which might be surprising to some of you, that Abu Dhabi is by far the largest state. It has 87% of the land area of the UAE. The next photo is a ruler of, just to show how these Trucial rulers, who they were and how they got together on these formal meetings in Dubai for the Trucial States Council. And in this case, it's just some of them leaving such a meeting. The major influence that one has to talk about in those for those days, for these decades on the Trucial coast was, of course, the other power, and that was the ruler of Dubai. Since 1958 already, the Sheikh Rashid bin Saeed Al Maktoum was the ruler of Dubai, and he was certainly a very important player on the coast, and next to when Sheikh Zayed came along. The year 1967, I just picked that out to show and talk about that at that time, in 1967, the Trucial state's future had never really looked better. The future really looked very rosy. Why? Abu Dhabi exported oil from onshore and offshore since 1962, and these figures, the exports grew year on year, and one was looking towards a very good future in Abu Dhabi for that reason. In Dubai, things were not bad at all. There was, in Dubai, the ruler was able to give a contract for £9 million contract in order to build a new harbor outside the creek. And that was signed in June 1967. And this harbor was originally designed to accommodate 4 overseas vessels, 4 large vessels, and while it was being constructed, even enlarged to accommodate more vessels. In Sharjah, too, things didn't look bad in 1967 because the Royal Air Force base was being expanded, partly because of the loss of the British base in Aden. So men and people from Aden were transferred to Sharjah, which of course improved Sharjah's economy enormously. So it certainly suited the rulers of the Trucial states to be quite comfortable under the British umbrella. It was a safeguard. It provided diplomatic and military safety, and there was no need to be too worried also about predators from outside. And we also do remember that the British government actually acted in 1955 to safeguard enormous territory of Abu Dhabi that was under dispute. And the British initiative was certainly remembered by the other Trucial rulers. So this was not the time for any of them to want to be pushed, even by their population possibly, to lead a fight for independence or freedom or whatever. Slogans were obviously also drifting along with newspapers from Cairo. However, a completely new situation for the Gulf states did come about, and it came from the outside, not from the inside. It came about because of British internal politics. The Labour government, depending very much on the finance and the say-so of the unions, had agreed to withdraw all military commitments from east of Suez, and originally the Gulf was exempted from that, but eventually in January of 1968, some hapless diplomat had to return to the Gulf and talk to all the ruling courts, and also had to go to Tehran and inform all of these in every station, to inform the people, the rulers, of the unilateral abrogation of the treaty relationship which Britain had with the Gulf, and really practically the withdrawal of the British umbrella. What was actually additionally very problematic, that was a very short time was given. The withdrawal should be finalized by the end of 1971, and the countries were expected to prepare for new situations in that short time, which would have been three and a half hours. This declaration concerned not only the 7 Trucial states, but at the same time also Bahrain and Qatar. This declaration really left the rulers completely taken by surprise. This declaration of January 1968. There were legacies of unresolved territorial disputes for some of the rulers. So the reaction was first absolute consternation, not only immediately in the Gulf, but also by the Saudi king. The first to react was Sheikh Isa, the ruler of Bahrain, who in January said that there should be some federation of Gulf Emirates, and that this federation should certainly be cobbled together not by outsiders, but be their own making. Actual action came first of all with the initiative taken by Sheikh Rashid and Sheikh Zayed, who met on the 18th of February of 68 on the borders between their two states and sorted out some border problems. And then they decided to federate, to merge some institutions and make some sort of a union that would include, for instance, foreign affairs and immigration and other matters in a merger. But also they issued an invitation to other states to come together and discuss the way forward and to actually join their union, which they had created already. So they sent out this invitation, and already on the 25th of February, 9 rulers came together. That was the 7 Trucial states rulers and the rulers of Bahrain and Qatar. Now, one could have expected that maybe first only the 7 rulers got together with Sheikh Zayed and Sheikh Rashid and sorted things out. But Dubai was very insistent that Qatar should participate even in this first meeting to dilute Abu Dhabi's power. Abu Dhabi, in turn, wanted Bahrain present because Abu Dhabi had a close relationship with Bahrain, used Bahraini currency, and many administrators and teachers had already come to help to develop the Abu Dhabi's the institutions. Now, these 9 rulers came together in a meeting like we see here on the photo. What was unexpected in this meeting was that Qatar came with a draft, a formalized draft for some sort of constitution, which certainly must have surprised all these sheikhs. Some of whom you can see, maybe you see on these pictures, most of them are actually illiterate and would have been very hard pushed to figure out that moment what was meant with the constitution that was talking about parliaments and foreign affairs and division between divisions of powers and all of this. So this type of meeting, as we see here, really occupied 3.5 years of intensive consultation. I would call it a detour of trying to come to statehood at the end of 1971. There were consultations on many levels. The rulers came together very often at that time. Their deputies, the crown princes, their various committees, which were staffed by either people from the 9 Emirates or also with the help of foreign advisors who participated intensively in these discussions. And some of the Emirates had more foreign advisors or more high-powered. And certainly some of the participants in these meetings tried minimize the British and keep the British at a distance, which was quite often not easily possible, because many of the discussions involved how to separate. But certainly this whole issue must have been a very steep learning curve for the leadership in all of those 9 Emirates, some of which were very, very up on it and very well organized, and certainly make the most also of foreign advice from very high-powered foreign Arabs, of Egyptian and other helpers, Sudanese as well, but some of the other Trucial states in particular, they're probably struggling to come up with the right sort of input in every one of those meetings. What also happened in these 3.5 years was long pauses where there were no meetings, and some pauses were because one couldn't agree in the previous meetings. But the most important aspect of these long pauses was waiting for the decision from the Conservative government, because in March, in spring of 1970, in Britain there had been a change of government. The Conservative Party was back in power, and in these months and years before, several Conservative MPs and other important people had visited all the 9 Emirates and had muttered about the possibility that if the Conservative government get back to power, they would reverse this decision of withdrawal. Now, in spring of 1970, that chance had come up, but it took another several months until the summer of 1971 that the British government, the new Conservative British government, finally declared that the withdrawal would go ahead, and it would go ahead at the appointed time at the end of 1971. That moved things in other quarters. First of all, in the summer of 1971, Bahrain declared its independence. It's a long other problem, or why that was so important, because Bahrain had been claimed by Iran, and it got, with the help of the United Nations, out from under that claim. Immediately, Qatar followed suit as well and declared its independence. Both of these newly independent Emirates immediately applied for membership of the United Nations. In Abu Dhabi, in the summer of 1971, one was preparing for the possibility that also Abu Dhabi would have to go it alone. And so they created a cabinet and the National Consultative Council, which was a local Abu Dhabi parliament. So at the same time, also in that same summer, also the Trucial states that were now left on their own, because Bahrain and Qatar had left, got together again and were actually able to agree on a draft constitution, on a provisional constitution, how to go forward and how to put all the Trucial states together in one state. But alas, the discussions were not to the liking of Ras Al Khaimah, which was trying to get better terms within this new provisional constitution, and did not sign the agreement on the 10th of July for the provisional constitution. Ras Al Khaimah then, in fact, joined the federation in early 1972. But now there was the Trucial states had agreed to provisional constitution in the summer of 1971. So it was just a matter of organizing the actual signing and getting away from under the British government. And that was then organized for December at very short notice. One didn't know beforehand which day in December it would be, but it happened to be the 2nd of December when all the rulers got together in Dubai, and the signing away of the sovereignty, or signing complete sovereignty over to the federation. And that was, of course, into the hands of the newly elected president, that was Sheikh Zayed, who had been elected president by the 6 other Trucial rulers. And on the same day, there was a signing between the now newly created United Arab Emirates and the UK. And we see this signing ceremony on this photo, and on the photo signed on the UK side by Sir Geoffrey Arthur, who was the last political resident, and Sheikh Zayed, the elected president of the UAE, and next to him, Sheikh Rashid bin Saeed, ruler of Dubai, and next to him, Khalid bin Mohammed of Sharjah, and behind them is Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, the newly elected, selected, designated prime minister, and then also Ahmed Khalifa Suedi and Mohammed Mahdi Tajer, both of whom were instrumental in helping this process along throughout all these 3.5 years. And of course, Ahmed Khalifa Suedi became the first foreign minister and did wonders for the United Arab Emirates in its first few years. This next photo shows a lineup of the rulers of. It's still in December 71, and in fact, 2 of the elderly rulers are not present on this photo, but there are their crown princes. In Sheikh Khalid bin Mohammed, who is still on this photo, was then killed in February 1972 by the deposed previous ruler of Sharjah, Sheikh Zakar bin Sultan al-Qasimi, who had thought that he could rally people in Sharjah who were discontented over the arrangements between Sharjah and the Shah of Persia with regard to Abu Musa. But in the skirmishes that ensued, Sheikh Khalid was killed, and eventually his brother, Sultan bin Mohammed, became the ruler of Sharjah. The withdrawal agreement was easily done, but how to proceed with the actual withdrawal, of course, was another matter. And certainly the function of the commanding of the military, which was the Trucial Scouts, had to be handed over to the president. And otherwise, there were lengthy processes of replacing existing British laws, which pertained to laws to do with air movements, with traffic, with jurisdiction over non-nationals on UAE, on the territories of the individual emirates, and many more legal arrangements had to be rescinded or changed. So, in fact, there was a huge legal void. Laws had to be created there and then and ad hoc, or were they? It was certainly a task that these rulers, which we see on this photo, and their ministers and the Federal National Council had to now, that was their task, to fill this void with laws and regulations, and to make the whole setup work. the beginning of always, I think, when one thinks of states now, one also thinks of the input from the population, and that is certainly here too. The provisional there was a federal national council was provided for. In this case, it was for 40 nominated male members. This inauguration was done in early 1972. Sheikh Zayed, as the president, officiated, but as we see on this photo, there's still no flags, no emblems, because it happened in a building outside the old fort, which had actually simply been used for sometimes for majlis with the ruler and otherwise for the meetings of the Abu Dhabi State National Council, which was NCC, National Consultative Council, which had already had some sessions, and its flag, Abu Dhabi flag and Abu Dhabi emblem were installed. So soon, not soon, it took a long time until the Federal National Council got its own building to operate in. It was in the 1980s, it was finished. The provisional constitution for the federation needs to be just slightly commented, because this constitution, as I have mentioned earlier, was really much of it. The details were a relic from what the Union of the Nine had finally been able to concoct and put together. This constitution, when we look at it gives enormous. It shows very strong centralist tendencies, and it gives important legislative and administrative powers to the Union. It was still then called the Union and not the Federation, and it was by also give enormous powers to the president, who was the president with the highest authoritative in the land was indeed the Supreme Council of the Seven Rulers. And the president of this Supreme Council was the president of the UAE. However, the reality, the constitutional reality or the political reality in the 1970s was quite different. And that was very largely because Dubai insisted on functioning independently with its existing institutions, its law courts, its medical setup, and so on. And also Dubai was willing to pay for all of this themselves. The rudimentary institutions of the other states, which really had to be built up quite often from zero, they were in charge. They were in the care of the federal ministries, which themselves were being built up and constructed. Abu Dhabi, at the same time, was already, as I said earlier, quite well established in that it had a full cabinet since July 71, and this consultative council of 40 members, which at the time actually were very vociferous and also being listened to. So Abu Dhabi operated like a separate state. However, Sheikh Zayed himself, the ruler of Abu Dhabi and president of the United Arab Emirates, was adamant about developing the federation, and he did everything possible to bring this about. In particular, Abu Dhabi's finances from the oil revenues were they financed entirely the federal household. For the first few years, there had been federal household which was actually over endowed, and couldn't the these newly established federal ministries could not even operate fast enough to use up the money that they were allocated over the year. So that shows that Abu Dhabi, and certainly at Sheikh Zayed's initiative, the UAE was going to be a federally run state. As a federation, the UAE gained acceptance among the tribal population because they would sort of have said, the people who in the beginning didn't really know one way or the other of what would be advantageous for them if they lived somewhere in Ras Al Khaimah in a little village. But it soon became obvious to all these people that if Sheikh Zayed pays, well, we will be okay. And this photo here just shows, or it for me, it demonstrates that the unionizing of the politics in the 70s and beyond was hard to bring about, because the highest decision-taking authority, as I explained earlier, was the Supreme Council of the 9 rulers. And the way it is put in the constitution, it looks like an organ which would meet like a cabinet, like every fortnight, every week, every periodically and very often, and sort out everything that needed to be sorted out. But alas, it did not. The Supreme Council did not meet often for months, and sometimes not even for years, not at all. This building was built in Abu Dhabi to hold these meetings, but it stands empty, and it was actually used by lectures and things later on. Because the highest decision-taking authority didn't meet very often, it was really left to the president, who, through the constitution, was also empowered to take decisions by decree, then pass these decisions, pass the Supreme Council or the Federation, the FNC, but that just didn't happen. So ruling by decree became a routine, and it equally also meant that in the local administration, the individual emirates also, they evolved their own administration, and it often evolved in parallel to what the federal ministries involved. And these individual rulers in Ajman or Al-Quwain, they were considered by their people as still to be the best avenue for obtaining the things they needed, be it a piece of land or be it that someone paid for a son to study abroad or whatever. And so there was parallel authority within the state, partly federal and partly the local administration. And Sheikh Zayed managed, or he supported these rulers on the side. Nobody knew when and how and why, but so that they could fulfill their traditional role as the rulers and ruling families of their emirates. There was a debate about, the debate had to come about in 1976 about now coming up with a proper constitution and to supplant the provisional constitution, and which was after 5 years. It in the provisional constitution it stipulates that after 5 years a formal constitution has to be agreed, and so this would have come up in 1976. And the general popular expectation was that there would certainly be progressive centralization. There would be certainly an abolishing paragraph 23, which stipulated that the natural resources of every emirate actually belonged to every emirate. And that obviously dates from the constitution concocted by the 9 emirates before. There was expected to be augmentation, enlargement of the parliamentary representation. Also, unification of the armed forces was an issue, and unified control of immigration was also an issue. But the leaders, when they did get together and discussed all this, in 1976, they decided to extend the duration, the validity of the provisional constitution, originally for 5 years, but they certainly ditched the need to come up with a new document. However, in February 1979, things had progressed to a sort of head, in that it was seen to be important that somehow the federation should be consolidated by unifying the institutions progressively, and just be more 20th century in the way things were being run. So the Federal National Council, together with the Council of Ministers, came up with a referendum suggesting how change could be effected. This news of this came out, and there was a student demonstration. They even came from all over the country to come to Abu Dhabi and to Dubai to demonstrate, because they demonstrated to support Sheikh Zayed, whom they perceived as being the centralizer, and who would bring about more centralization of the federation. However, a counter memorandum was put together in Dubai, and that was opposed to such attempt at centralization. So more discussion amongst all the rulers, and a compromise was found. The compromise was to strengthen the federal authorities with various suggestions and so on, and also that Sheikh Rashid should, the ruler of Dubai, should now be the new prime minister, and with his authority, the federal authorities should be strengthened. And he was then the prime minister from 1981 to until he died in 1990. But throughout that time, he was mostly incapacitated by being ill. 1979, of course, coincided with the revolution in Iran. Much marching and students on the Abu Dhabi, on the UAE television itself. Students could see how students marched in other countries. That was not entirely lost on them. But the Iranian Revolution also was then the beginning, or soon after, was followed by the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from 1981 to 1988. And it certainly was not the time to exacerbate internal disagreements. One was very ready to close ranks. This here is a photo of the National Consultative Council that was then built in the 80s, but it was, as one can see, first of all, it was laid out for a very much larger number. Also, not only the conference room, but the whole building would be rooms for many more members of parliament than the 40 that were initially sitting in it. And it was not used, or they didn't often come together as a Federal National Council throughout the 80s. It was pretty well dormant. When they did come together, it was meetings with other members of parliament from other nations and so on. The FNC was not very active throughout all that time of the 1980s when the problems in the Gulf and the war was certainly between Iran and Iraq was certainly providing a very problematic climate. While the domestic consolidation was still in flux, an important aspect was that the UAE made enormous progress in strategic use with foreign policy. And that was particularly Sheikh Zayed's philosophy, his project, his effort, and he put some money to it as well. He could. He had a team that made enormous efforts to help to put the UAE on the international map. But what was particularly important was first to make friends with the Arab neighbors, the Arabs around in the Arab world, who in their newspapers actually had called the UAE and others stooges of colonialism and imperialism. Now, Sheikh Zayed worked towards becoming called Arab brother. And also they cultivated, for instance, close ties with Pakistan. So the Arab world came round to accepting the United Arab Emirates. And the rest of the world also were more and more taken in. For instance, also the UAE decided to have diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and had many diplomatic ties with many countries, more than they had people to actually man the embassies. And they also made efforts to mediate, for instance, in Lebanon and Syria, and very, very active on the international scene then and now. A completely different aspect, of course, is how was then the Emirates population developed and brought forward. And in this respect, education was the most important aspect. Now, early education was first provided from outside, from Kuwait, which was and the Kuwaiti and later the publicly locally paid education brought many foreign teachers into the town, particularly Egyptian and Palestinian, which later on had some flip side seen by the society. But schools were in the 1960s already schools for both men and girls, and the education was free at every point: kindergarten, school, university. The the UAE University was founded in 1977. There were many government scholarships abroad, and also later some local families paid for their children, for their boys in particular, to study abroad. So society now has a fundus of many young people who have, not so young by now, who have studied abroad in America and elsewhere, and bring their expertise and also their worldview to the society of the United Arab Emirates. From 1988 onwards, in fact, something strange happened, that the tertiary education was now in the Higher College of Technology was only in English, which at the time in the Gulf was a very, very strange, also seen by many families. Women education, if I come back to this, was pushed forward, particularly with these higher colleges, and the economic, achievements of women's education is by now something that the country wears like a big honor badge on its vest quite often, and they can be rightly proud of the fact that women's education has had enormous impact on society. And for instance, 60% of the university graduates are females, but half the members of the Federal Natural Council now are women, and several female ministers and diplomats, ambassadors, professors, artists, women startup entrepreneurs. They are everywhere you look. You can find some very impressive women, and that is certainly something that is due to the money and effort that had been put into the education. On the domestic front, how has the country fared in political terms? And there one has to, after the Kuwait crisis and from the 1990s onwards, one can see an enormous development of the individual Emirates branching out on their own path of glory. One can almost say that the ruling families became very active, and many of them got themselves advisors and outside help to drive their economy in their emirate forward and find their niche of their particular forte also. We know, of course, Dubai was the port to begin with, and then business in general, finance, and the development of tourism. And Dubai wants to be a globalized platform. Sharjah specializes in education, culture. The benefit from the proximity of Dubai, of course, helps Sharjah financially. And Fujairah, being benefiting from the geography on the Indian Ocean side and along the shipping lanes, has bunkering, is one of the biggest bunkering ports and container ports. And Ras Al Khaimah, it continues with agriculture and lots of quarries and cement industry, and also a big pharmaceutical industry by now. Some of the not wealthy rulers who couldn't make things go quite so well, they were nevertheless helped by Sheikh Zayed's generosity to continue to play the role vis-a-vis their tribal people and their nationals that was expected. Every emirate has displays to the visitor, can be seen, that it has both affluence and deprivation. We can see enormous affluence, and we can see also degradation of the environment with the cement factories and the lorries and the ribbon development and the neglect of outside towns. So it isn't all glory and roads paved with gold. An important aspect one has to touch, I would like to touch on, is of course the UAE's role in the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC. This council was founded in 1981 when the two difficult neighbors, Iraq and Iran, were at war. It was an institution that was loose enough that it was helpful for politicians, but not binding very much. And the annual meetings were always eagerly awaited and stage managed in the capitals and seen as very important. But as time went on, the individual countries also strode out to look for their own possibilities of foreign policy, which sometimes clashed or had problems with the ideas of the other members, of the 5 other members of the GCC. Also, as far as the UAE was concerned, Certain views changed after Sheikh Zayed died in 2004, particularly the attitude towards Iran. There was a growing antagonism. Also, the Muslim Brotherhood philosophy or underlying ideology suddenly struck home. And it was found that in some of the neighboring countries, there were different attitudes. And that was, in my view, probably one of the reasons why some of the GCC countries fell out with Qatar. It was certainly over the Muslim Brother issue. There are, of course, other issues as well. Bahrain and Qatar had border disputes for many reasons. It was eventually solved by a verdict of the Court of Justice. Again, the different members of the GCC had different approaches with the Syria problem and supported different groups which were on different sides within the Syrian theater of politics and war. Abu Dhabi certainly moved closer to Riyadh, and in the last few years, probably because also Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed and the son of the king in Saudi Arabia are of a similar age and would somehow maybe can communicate better. There was a question in my email of why did Yemen not become a member of the GCC? Why was it not allowed to or not made a member of the GCC? All the 6 GCC countries have a sort of, they are, I don't like the word, but they are called monarchies. What it denotes is that their system of government is different from the other countries and certainly from Yemen as well. And they certainly did not, on the long run, consider having to share with a country with a different governing system. They are sort of as an inner circle. Yemen, nevertheless, became a member of the Gulf Football Federation. There is, of course, the question of what is now within the GCC happening vis-a-vis Yemen. In the first instance, in March of 2015, when Yemen was attacked from the GCC countries. In this case, Qatar was still part of it. I think it's impossible for me to speculate, but I think nobody knew what they were letting themselves in for. I've been to Yemen several times, and I know that nobody seems to understand how one could possibly figure out how to dominate Yemen. It's also, of course, a question what is actually Yemen, and to what extent does the South and Aden still really is considered part of the west of Yemen. My last point would be to talk just a little bit about the Emiratis, so how the UAE needs, or has as the leadership, has the urge to strengthen Emirati solidarity. After all, the UAE population, the citizens, are 12% of 9.5 million population, 12%. And these 12% are more and more helped to feel like a privileged group. If one, for instance, looks at the leading local Arabic papers, and the Etihad, then one can see that in that newspaper it looks as though almost the population is 90% local and in national dress, and the rest are others. But in recent years there have been efforts to promote in the flag, and we have had almost a cult of the previous president, Sheikh Zayed. In 2018 was the year of Zayed, when a lot of efforts were made to remind him and remember the population of his input. And in that respect is also the Abu Dhabi and Dubai really work in tandem, and each have their own strengths in trying to project the UAE to the outside world. And unlike in the 80s, when at times Dubai actually didn't seem to mention abroad that it was part of the UAE, now it is certainly they very much jointly and together emphasize their national identity and also the achievements. And there is now a growing emphasis, a very, very fast growing, strong growing emphasis on promoting science and technology education. And they also want to achieve this technological education. And so what one can do is one can buy world-class experience and expertise and then twin that with some local talent, and then to put investment into it, and then public and private. And there are certainly many projects that have gone ahead, particularly now during this corona pandemic, where the UAE has forged ahead with making its own PPE and test kits, and goes on with research, and was able to send, as we see here on this picture, tons of equipment to other countries. And this is not only to protect its image and to polish the image abroad, but this genuinely is the result of an age-old, a decade-old commitment to share some of the wealth of this country with the poorer in other parts of the world. And now I have come to an end. Thank you.
Robin, can I hand over to you?
Thank you, Frauke. Very interesting, very comprehensive. One of the key issues that fascinated me is the way that the UAE has developed, in the sense that it started off, very much dominated by the Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and who were very much in competition for a long time for control of the federation. It's very clear now that the policy side is very much dominated by Abu Dhabi, and for a long time Dubai devoted itself to the economy and business, which was understandable. I assume it'd be interesting, subject to your view, that this dates back to 2008, 2009, when the balanced relationship probably changed fundamentally. But if I come to a question, and one which has been put by others as well, is perhaps the foreign policy of the Emirates now dominated by Abu Dhabi, and so that the decisions are to act on Yemen, towards Qatar, towards Iran, have been taken essentially by Mohammed bin Zayed, without Dubai necessarily having much for say in them, because Dubai has certainly had some economic difficulties, perhaps as a result of the Qatar and Iranian policies in particular. Is that a fair definition of the division of responsibilities today?
Yeah, I think that is a fair, yes, one could certainly see it that way. And also maybe one could add that Dubai also over all those years didn't really want to be bothered with obligations abroad, if that could be helped. Their obligations or their contact abroad would be mostly, they would wish it to be economic.
I understand that. I
And
think
in
that it seemed early on that they wanted to be sure that they were keeping on an even political keel or constitutional keel with Abu Dhabi. And I don't know whether the deaths of Sheikh Rashid and the supremacy of Sheikh Zayed had an influence on that process as well.
Well, not. I don't think so, because certainly Sheikh Zayed, I think, made absolutely certain in later years. It looked like that he would not want to be seen to be in any way usurping more, let's say, more kudos, more following in Dubai than necessary. He had Abu Dhabi, and he certainly cared really very much about the other Emirates. And if Dubai wanted something from him, he was there. But one does remember that visits were less frequent in later years.
Thank you. That's an interesting insight. I mean, perhaps what we're seeing today, and this is another part of the question that came in earlier, was that there's the foreign policy and the strategy that you described was very much the UAE using its soft power in support of its international interests. But it does seem now that soft power has given way to a slightly tougher and more belligerent policy in Yemen and in support and in Libya, and maybe
Libya.
Towards Qatar, maybe not Qatar, not in the same league as the military elements of the Emirati involvement in Libya and in Yemen. But nevertheless, there seems to have been a bit of a development there in its approach to foreign policy.
Yes, certainly. I could only speculate in some ways that have we not seen everywhere, where eventually, if you have money and people want to sell you a lot of weapons, you buy a few, and when you have them, you might feel that this is handy if you want to make a point. The other aspect, I think, is also, which is slightly on a different line, and yet chronologically, I think, comes to the same, and that is what I talked to in the last part. This wish to consolidate the coherence of your citizens, and the decision in 2014 to introduce national service was certainly part of that, and certainly very much had this effect, and it was complete. There was Sheikh or whoever, or son of whoever. They all had to participate. There was no out of it. And now it has been changed to actually 18 months since 2018. And that is on a different level also, a reason why one looks more towards the military aspect of one's politics and the possibilities of what the range of means of responding one actually has to hand.
Yeah, I see.
One would say that 30 years ago there was none like this.
No, I don't want to go further with this one because I think we are using up time, but I got two people who've asked the same question. David Tomlinson and Mark Moody-Stewart have both asked if you could just say a few words about the relationship between the UAE and Oman, current, but also maybe with the historic background. I hope that doesn't open too long an answer, but it's but we didn't touch on it. Neither of us have touched on the relationship with Oman, and perhaps
yes,
we should.
Yes, which I regret because we realize, of course, historically there is an enormous connection between the Trucial states and Oman and all the tribes. There was a very close relationship between the Sultan and Sheikh Zayed. As soon as it was sorted out who was who, because in the first onrush of federating, let's all federate, actually there was a suggestion that Oman, having changed, acquired the new Sultan in 1970, that Oman should also be part of the federation. And when that was sorted out, that the Sultan said no way, then there was a more even playing field, and Abu Dhabi and the UAE in general have had on and off relations with Oman, but to begin with, very, very good and warm and generous relations. Abu Dhabi has paid for many, many roads and many other developments in Oman in the past. But there have been problems more recently, and one can only say this is regrettable because, we don't know with the new Sultan, but certainly Qaboos was by nature, I think, a moderating person, a moderating influence, and he made that influence work, and he had to all sides. And we must not forget that he also had a reason to be a moderating influence vis-a-vis Iran, because the Sultan had every reason to be grateful for the fact that the Shah had sent people to help him with the insurrection in Dhofar. And this gratefulness had to, continued, because the Sultan was that sort of person.
Thank you very much. Dave, Michael, should we call it a...
Thank you very much to both of you. Yes, I mean, we've dealt with the questions that we had. And I just say again, Frauke, thank you for an heroic performance against really frustrating odds. Just for your own reassurance, once David had sorted out the PowerPoint, everything seemed to go very well. For our audience, thank you very much indeed for staying with us through what cannot have been an easy listen in the early parts. But a great many of you are still there, and I think that's a huge testimony to
thank you very much for all of you. I'm so sorry.
No, well, no matter. For those who are interested, Frauke also gave us an extremely insightful blog post a week or two back relating to COVID-19 in the UAE, and you can find that on the Society's blog. And we will look into ways in which we can make sure that a proper, complete, and listenable version of Frauke's talk is available online before too long. Next week, we have a talk on Thursday, not on Wednesday, and at 6 o'clock in the evening, uncharacteristically, when we are jointly hosting a talk by Caroline Lamb, journalist, about her latest book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield. And I hope you'll join us then. We will be sending out the notification for that in the next 24 hours. And for now, it just leaves me to thank all of you, but Frauke and Robin especially, for this, hugely informative and interesting event that I hope you will remember in the end more for its content than for its oddities. But thank you very much indeed.